Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to be repurposing some of my old DIYs and also making over some old decor that I've had in my stash. For this first project, you may remember these frames that I've used twice in two different videos. I still have them and I wanted to remake these over. This time I'm going to be using some of these little moldings that I got from Amazon. And for these first moldings, I'm just using some hot glue to fill these in, and I'm going to make 8 of these. Now you can definitely use clay in these molds, but I find that sometimes I don't want to use my clay and I would prefer to use the hot glue because it's less expensive than the clay. But I am going to be using some air dry clay to make 2 of these longer moldings, and you'll see how we're going to use those in the end. And as always, everything I'm using in today's video is linked below in my Amazon store. Now here, I'm just using my fingers to wipe off the excess clay, and then I will clean up all the edges before removing this. Once I remove it, I do clean up all the edges. I just rub them down and kind of pat them down. And then I'm going to make 1 more of these, and I will set these aside to dry for 24 hours. Now to finish off the frame, those pieces that I used hot glue for, I am just going to hot glue those on each corner of both frames. Now, I think I forgot to mention, but I did use one of those moldings for that top piece right there in the center. But once I had everything glued on, I did take this outside and spray painted it with 1 coat of my Rust-Oleum white paint. And then I brought it back inside to give it 1 more coat of my Waverly white chalk paint, just to make sure that I got into all those little creases. Now the next day, those clay pieces that I had set aside were almost completely dry, so I'm just using some Gorilla Glue gel super glue to attach these to the outside of the frame about 3/4 of the way down. And then for the second one, I just kind of lined it up with the first one and then glued it down as well. Then finally, for this project, I'm just using some of my European Gold Rub and Buff, and I'm going around all the corners and the little middle piece at the top there, and I'm just rubbing this over all of the raised areas. I did end up just leaving the clay without the Rub and Buff. And then once I hung these, I could add in some florals or some greenery down behind where the clay pieces are. This next project is a piece from my stash of thrifted finds. I don't even remember when I got this. It was some time ago, but I figured this was a great time to start making over some of my stuff that I just haven't had a chance to do yet. I did cut down a little piece of thin cardboard to fit right in where the mirror is, just so that I won't get paint on this, and then I'm going to give this 2 coats of my white chalk paint. Now I want to stamp the mirror part, so I am taking some painter's tape and I'm gonna tape around the edges because the stamp that I'm using is just a little bigger than the mirror, and this is a stamp that I got from Amazon. Again, it's linked below for you, but it's just a stamp of like a book page, so I'm gonna use my archival ink and then I'm gonna stamp this mirror. Now I probably wasn't as careful as I should have been, and the stamp did move around a little bit and it smeared just a tiny bit, but I still thought that it looked really good. Then once I removed all the painter's tape, I went back in again with some of my European Gold Rub and Buff, and I went over all the raised edges. If you've been here a while, you may remember this vase that I did last year. This is a Dollar Tree vase, and I added on these clay handles and then painted this to mimic a version of a Pottery Barn vase. But lately I've been seeing these found vases everywhere. They're super popular, and I thought it was time to give this a makeover. So I started out by giving this one coat of my black chalk paint, and you'll see as I go through this, I blend a ton of colors. Here I watered down an apple barrel color that is called Warm Buff, and I'm going to go over this entire vase with that watered down paint. Now again, this was a bunch of trial and error with the colors. I couldn't quite figure out what color exactly I wanted this to be for the base of it. So I did go in again with a different paint color. This time I used a little bit of metallic copper, and then once I had a few little spots of that painted on, I went back in with that watered down Warm Buff color. Then I decided to rub some flour all over this vase because it was still just too dark for what I was trying to go for. So after I rubbed all of this flour all over my vase, I took that brush that was still wet with the Warm Buff and just tried to blend in the flour and wipe off the excess. Now I did want this to be a bunch of different colors kind of blending in with each other. So once I had the flour finished, I did take this outside and I kind of spritzed it with a little bit of white Rust-Oleum paint. You can see it has some little spots there on it, and then I also spritzed it with a little bit of Rust-Oleum gold paint. And then finally, for the fun part of this vase, I'm taking some Dollar Tree spackling and I'm gonna put it in a little bowl, and then I added one tiny drop of this Warm Buff paint and kind of mixed it in because I didn't want this to be stark white, but I also didn't want it to be really dark on the vase. So once I mix that in, I am just going to rub this all over the bottom and the middle section of this vase. And then once I had this rubbed all around this vase, I waited a few hours for the spackling to dry. Then I gave this whole thing a really light sanding and I sprayed it with some Aleene's acrylic sealer. For this next project, you may or may not remember this jewelry box that I thrifted. I actually thrifted this back in June of last year and I showed it on my channel and I said I was going to make it over and I just did not have the time yet. So since I am making over some of my old decor and really trying to work through my stash of stuff that needs to be made over, I thought this would be a perfect time. So of course, the first thing I had to do was take this jewelry box all apart, and I made sure that I put everything in a little container so I wouldn't get it mixed up or lose anything. Then I gave all the pieces a light sanding and I'm going in with some of my white chalk paint, and this did end up taking about 4 coats, I think, to cover. After I had put the 4 coats on and let everything dry, I'm starting off with redoing the little drawers on this jewelry box. I'm going to be using some of my scrap paper. This is the same scrap paper that I've used in previous videos. It's from Amazon and I have it linked below for you, but I'm going to go ahead and cut those down to fit the sides of both of my drawers, and then I'm going to put some Mod Podge on the sides and add my scrapbook paper. Then once I had the scrapbook paper added on, I went back in with some more Mod Podge and sealed all the edges. Then I did the exact same on the other side and also on the other drawer. After I finished, I went back in with some of my white chalk paint to finish painting this where the paper didn't cover on the tops and the back side, and then I added a little bit to the edges of the paper. Now moving on to the actual jewelry box, I'm again going to be using some of my vintage scrapbook paper and again going to be using my silicone molds from Amazon for this project as well. So I went ahead and used my hot glue to make 2 molds, one for each side of this jewelry box. And again, you could definitely use air dry clay for this, and actually if I could go back, I do think that I would have used my clay instead of the glue for this project. Now while I'm waiting for those glue molds to dry, I cut down those pieces of scrapbook paper and I'm going to Mod Podge those to each side of this jewelry box. And then just like with the drawers, I went over this with some more Mod Podge to seal in all the edges. Then I just popped out my hot glue molds, and I did end up having to trim these down to fit the sides of my jewelry box, and I made sure that I pulled off all the little hot glue strings before painting this. But I did choose to go ahead and paint these with some of my white chalk paint before gluing them onto the jewelry box, even though it probably didn't matter because I do end up distressing the paper on the side of the jewelry box, just like I did with the drawers. But once they were dry, I just hot glued them right at the top of where the paper ended, and then went back in with some more of my white chalk paint to make sure that I covered it completely, and then like I said, I distressed the paper. Then for the doors, I'm again going to be using some more of that scrapbook paper. I wanted to put this on the inside of the glass, so I'm just tracing around it. I'll cut the pieces down and pop those back behind that piece of glass. Now, the reason why I wanted the glass in front is because this glass does have a really pretty floral etching on it. So I thought it would be really pretty just to have this in the background. For my final project, you may remember this boho rope clock that I did last year. Well, I took it all apart and I found this beautiful frame at my local thrift store, and I'm gonna start by painting this frame with a couple coats of my white chalk paint. While the frame is drying, I am taking apart this clock that I had used previously because for this project, we are just going to be using the face of the clock. Now, I needed a piece to fit the frame and also to insert this face of the clock into, so I cut down a piece of Dollar Tree foam board to fit the frame and then used the clock to cut out the center using a really sharp razor. I don't know if you can tell, but the clock face has a little lip on it, so I just made sure to make the hole a little smaller so that the clock would fit snugly. Then I wanted to cover the foam board with some contact paper. This is some contact paper that I actually got from Amazon a while back, and I just already had it on hand, so I put it onto the foam board and then cut the circle out again. But then I kind of realized that the black and white was just a little too stark for me, so I did go over it with one coat of my white chalk paint, and then I was able to put everything back together. Now I needed to cover up the outer edge of the face of the clock. So again, I'm pulling out those Amazon molds and some of my air dry clay, and I'm gonna make 4 of these larger pieces so that I can make a new frame for this clock. I also pulled out my smaller mold because I wanted to make a little decorative piece to go at the top of the clock, and I'm just using my air dry clay for that as well. Before the clay dries, I went ahead and put these all around the clock and shaped them around the clock to make the new face. And where the pieces meet at the edges, I just kind of squeezed them together and pressed them together so that you can't really tell where they meet. But then I just used some Gorilla Glue gel super glue to glue these down. To add the final touches to this clock in the frame, I am just adding some of that European gold rub and buff to all the edges and any raised areas around the frame. And then I did the exact same thing to those molding trim pieces that we added to the clock to make that new frame. And that is going to be it for today's video. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.